Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for helping in. My name is Ryan Samanyema. I'm a fourth year radiography student here in Nigeria, and apart from my studies, I'm also a proficient medical content writer. And today's an amazing day. I have an amazing guest speaker all the way from the United States of America. Hey, Alexander, could you
Great.
introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Alex Howson. I'm a medical writer for almost 20 years. Before that, I was an academic and a trauma operating room nurse. So I have a clinical background as well. And I host the Right Medicine podcast.
Awesome. That was an amazing intro, Alexander. So we have a couple of questions for you to answer. You ready?
Yeah, sure.
So if I'm looking down words, I'm reading the questions to Alexander to answer. I wrote down the questions below. So if I'm looking down words, I'm reading the questions to Alexander to answer. So the first question goes this way. Can you share some of your insights into the key skills, you know, and qualifications required to complete medical writing, specifically the CME slash CPD medical writing. To tell us more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It might be helpful to actually share a little bit about what CME writing is. As you know, Ransom, medical writing is a pretty broad umbrella. There are lots of different types of medical writing. CME, or continuing medical education, is just one specialty within the broader field of medical writing. Here in the United States, healthcare professionals have to complete a certain amount of continuing education every year to maintain their licensure, to maintain their certification to practice as physicians, pharmacists, nurses, dentists, and so on. And so there's a mandatory requirement for health professionals to participate in continuing education. And it's called different things. Continuing medical education is specifically for physicians, but nurses, pharmacists, dentists, and so on also have to participate in continuing education. So I'm just going to use the term continuing education for the moment. And health professions have to acquire so many credits every year. So medical writers work in this field of continuing education to create the content that supports education activities. A lot of these activities are online, so we might be talking about patient cases. We might be talking about some kind of game activity. Escape rooms are very popular just now. We might be talking about reading some text and answering some questions based on that text. There are a lot of different types of education activities that health professionals can participate in to get their continuing education. And of course, there are also some live events, and medical writers can be involved in those events too by helping presenters, expert faculty create slide decks and other material to support live continuing education activities. So in terms of skills and qualifications, first of all, having some familiarity with what continuing education is and what it involves. There are many sort of regulatory policies and compliance considerations and accreditation requirements associated with continuing education. So it's helpful for medical writers to be familiar with the kind of whole landscape of continuing education. Second, it's helpful for writers to be familiar with adult learning principles. What are some of the things that we can do, that we can pull into our writing that will help health professionals learn the content with ease? Because health professionals, as you know, are busy. There are lots of distractions. There are a lot of demands on their time. So we have to kind of make sure that all education content is accessible. Having some familiarity with what it is that health professionals actually do on a day-to-day basis. I would say that this is even more important than having a science background or a biomedical background, because what you're doing in this field is trying to create education activities that will help health professionals do something differently in order to improve patient care. So those are kind of three broad skills that I think it can be helpful to build as a writer in continuing education.
All right, thank you so much, Alexander, for sharing that with us. So, before I proceed to the second question, I got a lot of questions for you, but I'll make it, in a nutshell for you. So, when you talk about the skills and qualifications, required to complete medical writing, specifically for the CME and the CPD medical writing. So I want to know something. What about someone, maybe in engineering that has a background in engineering or has a background in tech that recently fell in love with venturing into medical writing and wants wanting to complete this, continuing education, like you put it, the CPD and the CME medical writing. Does the background of that person deprive him or her the skills and qualifications to complete the medical writing continuing education?
I don't think it's a disqualifier, but I do think there are some things to add to the mix. You know, as I kind of mentioned just a moment ago, I think it can be helpful to um, kind of start to educate yourself about scientific and healthcare terminology. And there are some resources we can put those resources in the show notes for your listeners, for your audience. Nude Mice is one resource that comes to mind. It's a book that kind of takes readers through medical terminology. So I think, you know, getting some sort of familiarity with um, not only medical terminology but the kind of wider landscape of healthcare in the you know, wherever you're located as a writer. So, you know, the US has lots of different healthcare systems um, in comparison to health systems in Europe and other parts of the world. So, wherever you're located and wherever your audiences are located, then it can be helpful to kind of get a sense of what healthcare looks like in your particular region or country or context. So terminology is one, healthcare landscape is another, and then I think the third thing is to try to get a sense of what continuing education content looks like. That's not always super easy because a lot of content is behind paywalls, but there are a number of websites where you can get access to examples of continuing education activities, what they look like, what they involve. And this will give you a sense of the bar you have to reach in terms of you know, creating education content, and maybe help you identify some of the skills that you might need to acquire in order to get there. So it's not impossible, but I do think there are probably some steps that folks with those kinds of backgrounds need to take. And then the last one is writing. How much writing experience have you had as an
Yeah.
engineering student, as a you know, if you're working in information technology? Start to look at your own writing with an eye to how can I translate this into writing for a different audience or writing about different topics.
Thank you so much for answering my question, Alexander. And I believe that the audience really grabbed what you just said. So that draws me to the second question for you. So, as a proficient a prolific, sorry, medical writer,
Hmm.
um, and teacher as well. So, what advice would you give to someone that wants to transition from another writing career other than medical writing to freelance medical writers? So, what is your advice that you would give to someone transitioning from another form of writing other than medical writing to freelance medical writing? So, what are your advice for them?
So is the question really about is the focus really on freelance, or is the focus on, using your skills in another writing context? Because there's almost two questions there.
Yeah, there are people that are not into medical writing, but they are freelancers, but they write other than things related to medical writing in general. So
Mm,
they're wanting to maybe people that write things about finances,
mm,
you know, talk about writing things about, the travel vlogs and those stuff and
mm,
that. So they
mm.
wanted to transition to the kind of writings they offer to the table to freelance medical writer. Being
Okay.
what they were before to being a freelance medical writer. So, what are your advice for them?
Well, I guess two things. One is, as I've mentioned before, I think everything that I've said before also applies in this situation. If you already work as a writer in another context, in order to move into writing for continuing education, you will need to familiarize yourself with what continuing education looks like. So those things we talked about earlier: accreditation, compliance,
Yeah,
adult learning, those sorts of things. And that can take a little bit of time. And I think one of the things to give yourself when you are moving from one context to another, or one type of work to another, is to give yourself some time and also some grace, because it's not necessarily a linear path. You can be sort of one step forward and two steps back, but that's the way it is for everyone. The second part of the question: if you're moving into freelance work, say you've been employed as a writer and you're wanting to kind of move into freelance work, the conventional advice is to try and do that while you're still employed. Um, to try and kind of identify and find a couple of clients that you could do some work for as a side hustle while you're still employed. That's not everybody's experience. It wasn't my experience. I was not employed when I started working as a freelance medical writer, and I do think it's possible to do that. I think it's maybe a little harder now than it was 20 years ago, but we also have more tools available to us to identify and find and connect with potential clients. You mentioned LinkedIn earlier. We have LinkedIn, which is a great professional networking platform, as well as email and other social media platforms, which can still be helpful in identifying and connecting with potential clients. So I guess my advice there is, if you have the opportunity to explore what freelance writing feels like while you're still employed, do that. If you're not currently employed, you can still um, start to build a freelance writing business one step at a time, by identifying and finding those prospective clients, having conversations with them, and very slowly building a relationship where you can start to talk about how you can support your prospective client in their work.
absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Before I ask you the third question, I want to throw more insight about what you just said about connecting with your future clients and building a relationship with them. You know, do you remember we didn't say connect with them and pitch your work? Don't just connect with your future clients, your prospective clients, and just start selling your work or marketing your work is just really incorrect thing to do. So you just have to build relationship with them, know their needs and wants, before you market your work. So thank you so much for sharing that, Alexander. So the third question goes this way. Now, in your experience, you have over 20 years of experience, so you're an amazing person. So what are some of the challenges medical writers face when starting and growing a professional CME slash CPD medical writing, and how can they overcome them? Tell us.
Well, I think one of the challenges is keeping up to date with what's going on in healthcare. So finding resources and a network who can help you do that is is a good kind of starting point. It can certainly be challenged. We live in a really fast-paced world. Healthcare is changing all the time. There are new drugs and treatments coming on the market all of the time, and so it can be pretty challenging to keep up to date with that. I think one of the things that you can do as a freelance continuing education writer, CME writer, is to narrow your niche, to really focus on maybe one or two or perhaps three specific areas where you can build expertise and you can really become the kind of go-to writer in that area. So maybe it's cardiology and neurology, or oncology and something else. Oncology is a pretty vast specialty, as I'm sure you know. So I think that narrowing your niche so that you are kind of building guardrails or parameters around the work you do can be one way to meet that challenge of sort of keeping up to date with what's going on in your field. I think the second thing is, if you're working freelance, it's really easy to get isolated and to feel as though you're disconnected from the rest of the community. And none of us are strangers to FOMO, to fear of missing out. And so I would highly recommend building your sort of network of trusted colleagues and peers, so that when you have questions about particular clients or projects or things that you're kind of coming up against that are posing a challenge for you, you have people in your network who will support you and answer your question. A lot of the time I see people posting on LinkedIn or maybe a couple of other forums, and they're asking questions, but they're not really asking those questions to their own network that they have cultivated. And by that, I'm talking about, maybe 6 people. They're kind of throwing those questions out into the wider universe, and people might not answer, or people might not know you well enough to give a nuanced answer that speaks to your particular circumstances. And so the second thing I would recommend is to grow your specific network, and you can do that in different ways. You can join professional development communities. You can start to have those conversations with people that you've met on LinkedIn offline. So just having a quick kind of phone chat, all those little touch points that go into building up a relationship with clients, you also want to do with people that you want to pull into your network as well. So I think those are probably two of the kind of main things that I would share with your audience.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It is an amazing nugget you dropped right there. You've been doing this for 20 years, so you literally know the challenges we, the medical writers, face. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
And those challenges change all the time. I mean, you still have challenges even when you've been working in the field for a long time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a kind of like minimal for people that we experience than we just, still growing in the field. So, um, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Alexander. So the next question goes this way. Can you discuss the role of storytelling, right,
Mm.
and narratives in medical writing,
Mm.
and how freelance medical writers can incorporate those elements into the work. You know how very important storytelling is, in terms of medical writing. So tell us.
Well, I think, we all love stories. And we learn. There's a fair amount of research now to suggest that we learn best when there's some kind of story. But a story doesn't necessarily have to be a grand thing in medical writing in general, or in CME in particular. It just has to be a kind of clear structure that takes the reader, the learner, from their starting point to where it is that you want them to end up. And there are lots of different structures or frameworks you can use to build storytelling into your content, sort of exposition, rising action, climax, resolution. There are more elaborate frameworks that will take the reader or the learner on a sort of hero's journey. A character has a problem, who meets a guide, who shares information from them. They meet an additional challenge, and then that challenge is resolved, and their overall kind of problem is addressed. And I think in clinical writing, in medical writing, in CME writing, there are different ways of thinking about storytelling, different ways of thinking about storytelling, and who the character is, and what the problem is. One of the things that is very particular to continuing medical education is a process and a document called a needs assessment. And a needs assessment is really an opportunity to capture all the elements of a story, to kind of get the ingredients for building a story that will support the education content. So I think one of the things that's interesting about CME is that you already have this kind of built-in process for pulling together all the elements of creating a story that will help clinical learners learn what it is that you're focusing on in the education activity.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. The importance of, storytelling and how to craft it, you know, to suit the audience, and I'll also add something. Visuals as well does work with
Yeah.
along with storytelling because you're writing to a wider audience, So to make it more clear, you need to add visuals, like if you're in a medical field, you want to talk about the metabolisms, that works in the body. You can't just stop talking about the cortisol, start talking about, the hormones and how they interfere. No, no, no. You can use a moving car and feel to talk about what you're talking about, and also using knowing how to break down, medical terminologies to people that not in the medical field to understand what you're saying. Rather than saying hypertension, you can just say high blood pressure. Rather than saying hypotension, which is literally means low blood pressure. So
Mm.
yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Alexandra.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think those are all great points. One of the things that is part of the experience of working as a medical writer in general and in continuing medical education in particular is that you're working as a member of a team. Even if you're freelance, you're working with other people with different roles and responsibilities for putting the content together. And that content is getting shorter and shorter. It's increasingly informed by the sort of science of micro learning. As we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, health professionals are really busy, and so having access to bite-sized chunks of learning material is often really, really effective. And you can incorporate those visuals, as you mentioned, using white space, using bullet points, using other sort of formats that help to really focus the learner's attention on small pieces of information, is another way that you can sort of bring, you can use storytelling work for you in the education context.
So I see that you own a podcast, Red Method, which is an amazing podcast, It's on Spotify and on YouTube. If you're interested, go check it out. She has an amazing content for you. So,
Thank you.
as a host for Right Medicine podcast,
Mm,
what are some recurring you know themes or problems that are particular interest or of importance to medical writers.
mm.
Right?
And so your question is about recurring themes of interest to medical writers on the Right Medicine podcast, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think the first one is, what is CME and how can I break into it? That's certainly a question that we hear from listeners, and it's something that we're trying to kind of create more content around, and all of the content that Right Medicine focuses on is really designed to help listeners learn more about what continuing education is and some of the things that they need to be concerned about. And the second thing that we hear, the second kind of recurring theme that a lot of guests on Right Medicine talk about are, I guess there's two: needs assessment and outcomes. How to develop focused, detailed, helpful needs assessments. What are some good strategies and frameworks for doing that? And similarly, how to collect and analyze and use robust outcomes data. These are really two themes that kind of recur in the field in general. They have for many years, and people are kind of constantly working on to try and figure out what are the best methodologies for doing needs assessments and for collecting and analyzing and sharing educational outcomes data. So I guess three things there: how to break into CME, how to develop needs assessments, and how to collect, analyze, and talk about outcomes data. These are things that fuel a lot of interest for listeners on Right Medicine.
Amazing, amazing. So we have the last question for you, but
Mm.
before that, I want to ask you a question after. So, Medicine has a newsletter on LinkedIn as well. You have a podcast as well on Spotify or also on YouTube. So talk us through what was your past initiative in finding out that podcast. What were you having in mind to create such an amazing podcast that adds value to people? So talk us through.
Oh, that's a great question. So the podcast has evolved. It started in the middle of 2020, actually, when we were still kind of shut down here in parts of the United States. For me, it was an opportunity I saw the podcast as an opportunity to stay connected with peers and colleagues and clients. Over time, the podcast has evolved into using that platform as a way to amplify the work that professionals in continuing medical education and continuing professional development are doing. So not just writers, but also planners and strategists and grant grant managers and educational designers and outcomes analysts, to really kind of amplify the work that they're doing in this field, because it's a little hidden. It can be hard to find if you're not a clinician and if you're not a medical writer. And so the podcast was a way to really showcase the work that people are doing. Increasingly, the podcast is focused on exploring some of the best practices in creating continuing education content. What are some of the things that we should be doing in order to make sure that the education content we create is targeted, focused, measurable, specific, and really resonates and reaches the health professionals that it needs to resonate and reach, or resonate with and reach. I've lost your sound. There we go.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering my question. So sorry, hold on. Sorry. So,
That's okay. That's okay.
all right. So sorry. Experiencing some light problems. So just bear with me. So, Alexander, we have the last question for you. So what events or opportunities, you know, in the world of CME and CPD writing, do you think freelance medical writers should be aware of, and how can they position themselves to take advantage of this, model or opportunity to tell us?
Well, I think the thing about CME is that it's not really going away. It'll continue to grow because of the way that, well, because of two things, I guess. One is, as I mentioned at the top of our conversation, it's here in the United States and in other parts of the world, continuing education is mandatory. And so that means that there is an ongoing need for creating quality educational content. And that's only going to continue to grow because the second thing is um, therapies, interventions, procedures, technologies are also continuing to expand. And health professionals need to know about all of these things in order to do their best work and improve patient outcomes. And so CME is kind of here to stay, I would say. Um, in order to position yourself as a freelance writer in CME, get to know clients in this field. So invest a lot of upfront time in building relationships with those prospective clients. It's a small industry, it's a small field. And a lot of work happens through relationships and relationship building. So I think in order to kind of position yourself, you really need to get familiar with uh, who the CME providers are. And there are, I can't speak for the rest of the world. Here in the United States, there are over 500 accredited education providers. The Accreditation Council for Continuing Medical Education has a list on its website of who those providers are, and you can use that as a starting point to start to research and get to know the types of education providers that you might want to work with. So those are the main things that I would emphasize.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for your
Of
time and
course.
effort, and sharing these amazing questions, very intriguing questions that you share your initiatives on. So we've come to the end of the session, or before we wrap up the session, what are your last words for the audience?
If you're interested in CME, then get to know the field, get familiar with what it's all about, connect with other people who work in this field, and build your professional development so that you are well equipped to support your clients and create quality educational content for health professionals.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alexander. So
You're
we've come to
welcome.
the end of the session. So if you love this content, do to like, subscribe, and share to your network. Hopefully, someone in your network will really value this video. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you.